Thanks to a certain UK games company, the name of Warhammer is rather widely known in the world. However, we don't actually know a huge amount about these medieval and Renaissance weapons. So we're going to ask here, how was the medieval Warhammer actually used and why? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now first up, I've had this Warhammer which some years ago got known as the WARHAMMER because it always used to hang on my wall for a long time, and I have talked about Warhammers in general in previous videos, but recently a little bit of new information has come to me about Warhammers, and I'm going to be covering some of that here, but we're also going to be fundamentally asking, why did people use these, where did they come from, and what are the techniques for their use, because we don't have an awful lot to go on. So, for some context, for some meaty context for those of you who don't necessarily know about these weapons, the vast majority of technical data we have for weapons use is focused on certain very popular medieval weapons, such as the sword, one-handed and two-handed swords used with a buckler or by themselves, the poleaxe, various other types of pole weapons such as the halberd, the partisan, the spear, and even the lance. But there are certain medieval weapons which were widely used, such as the warhammer and the mace and the flail, for example, which we don't actually know very much about why, or rather how they were used, or in some cases why they were used. So it's interesting to note that the treatises, the technical sources that, for example, I run my classes based on, focus on certain knightly weapons, but don't really give us very much to go on with the other ones. So, why and how do we know how to use them? Well, the first thing to say is that some of the instructional material we find in the treatises can be applied to related weapons. And when we're talking about warhammers, for example, of the short variety, we'll talk about long versus short in a second. When we're talking about the short variety, sometimes known as horseman's hammers, although they shouldn't only be known as that, you can put them widely, or kind of broadly speaking, into the same category as maces, flanged maces, spiky maces, and indeed battle axes, at least one-handed ones, because fundamentally a lot of the way that they're used is actually very similar. And in fact, as we'll see here in a second, in some treatises, they are also equated with the use of a large heavy stick or a cudgel, because basically anything that you can do with a top heavy implement, be it a hammer or a mace or a club or whatever, is kind of generally speaking quite similar. So, how does that differ to a sword? Well, there are some very fundamental differences with a sword. Firstly, most of the length of it is a blade. It's usually edged on at least one side, sometimes two, has a pointy end, usually has a crossguard and a pommel, and because of this, it balances nearer the hand. So not only is all of this the offensive part, but it balances very differently to a top-heavy weapon. And that should be self-evident. But in addition to the top-heavy weapon, such as an axe or a warhammer balancing at the top, and therefore meaning that it moves differently, you've also got to bear in mind you don't have the same type of hand protection that you do, at least on most of them. You don't have the same, there's a few you do, but most you don't have the same type of hand protection as with a sword. So it moves differently, you've got a different type of hand protection, and moreover, in terms of offensive use, you have only got a head, even if it's an axe with a crescent blade on it. You can only really offend the enemy, at least badly, with the head up here, which means you actually need to be quite precise, because any motions, any movements between you and them mean that there's a good chance you'll either hit them with the shaft down here or miss them completely with the head. So actually you've got to intersect two moving targets quite precisely. So some people think these are simple weapons to use, but actually, hilariously, it can actually be far easier sometimes to hit a moving target with a long blade than it is with a small top-heavy head. So why am I telling you this? Well, fundamentally, hopefully everything I've just explained to you will explain why these two weapons are used in slightly, or two sets of weapons, in other words, top-heavy weapons like warhammers and swords, are used in slightly different ways. So because swords are balanced close to the hand and have a handguard, often we do motions with them that stop or guard an opponent's weapon in this sort of way. Essentially what most of us in HEMA or fencing would call a parry, okay? So very often you will guard in a a kind of blocking way. Now, it's not to say that you can't do that, and definitely you can do it with top heavy weapons. But there are a few things to bear in mind. Firstly, they are top heavy, so the way that they move is somewhat different. So yes, you can block with them in similar ways, but you've got this very top heavy head waggling around, which means the inertia moves differently on your hand. But secondly, if you block something here and it slides down towards your hand, you're going to be hit in the hand, which admittedly you would usually be wearing a gauntlet if you're using these types of weapons, but not always. So there is another type of defensive action that we find in medieval martial arts, and that is, instead of stopping an incoming blow, either point up or point down or on either side, which is something we find in medieval and Renaissance treatises, and is the kind of normal way of dealing with attacks with later swords, such as basket-hilted broadswords or sabres or whatever, spadroons. You also find a different type of way of dealing with an attack, which in Fiore, for example, would be called a rabat. We could call this in English a beat or a deflect. That is, if something's coming in towards me, I knock the thing aside. It could be with the front edge, sweeping it out of the way. It could be the back edge, knocking it and then coming around. So the defences are often sweeping either downwards or upwards or with the back edge to the side. They are motions that mean that your blade intersecting the motion of the incoming attack, sorry there, intercepting the incoming attack, knocks it aside and creates an opening to strike into. Now, with that type of defence, if we call that a beat, okay, a beat is far more useful with a top heavy weapon which has inertia and movement to it, instead of simply stopping the incoming attack, which, as I say, you can do with a shafted weapon, but particularly with one-handed ones, it's often easier to knock, beat or smack aside the incoming attack and then follow up with a continual motion. This is actually something that we see done with large two-handed swords, keeping them in continual motion, knocking aside incoming attacks, and then striking back with your own attack. Because to suddenly stop them and then get them moving again is more difficult, because of course they have a lot more inertia to them. They are less nimble weapons than something like a side sword or a sabre. So stop and start is more difficult with a top heavy weapon or just a big heavy weapon. So coming back to the original question, who used these, why did they use them, and how did they use them? So these are commonly called horsemen's weapons, and in fact there is a category of Warhammer that are conventionally known as horsemen's hammers. And in fact, they were still being used as late as the 17th and even sometimes 18th centuries. But they were really popular in the 17th century because we still had armoured cuirassiers still in the age of gunpowder in the 17th century. And the horseman's hammer still being used, in fact, still being used all over Europe, but perhaps most famously in Eastern Europe, in places like Poland. But they were still being used in England as well. Now, hilariously, they were actually known as poleaxes in the period sources in England. And a poleaxe is more conventionally to us modern people one of these big two-handed weapons. We'll talk again, we'll talk about one-handed versus two-handed in a second. But these shorter ones, because they are shorter and used in one hand, are usually associated with heavy cavalry, being used from the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th centuries most commonly. And they are obviously also being carried alongside swords. So why would you use this rather than this? We'll come back to that question in a second. So they can sometimes be a backup weapon to the sword, they could be an additional weapon to the sword, they can be an alternative weapon to the sword, in the same way that the Ottomans, for example, carried different types of sword or different types of mace for dealing with different opponents. We know that was done in Europe as well. If you were coming up against light cavalry, either you would use your sword or your lance first, but then your sword. If you were coming up against other armoured people, then indeed you might switch to a mace or a hammer, because that might be more effective against them. But you might use this first, you might use this second. We'll come back to that point in a second. So these are commonly associated with cavalry, but it's very important to note that if we look at the medieval and Renaissance art, we do also see these in the hands of people on foot. Now, admittedly, they could be cavalry who've dismounted and are on foot for a moment, and therefore they're carrying their hammer around, because it would usually perhaps hang off the saddle. Sometimes it hang off their belt, but they, for some reason, have taken it with them. So it could be, just because they're shown on foot doesn't mean that they're necessarily infantry. They could just be cavalry who happen to be on foot. But I think it's fair to say that these were sometimes used on foot. But the conventional, at least for the 15th and 16th centuries, the conventional wisdom is that on foot people usually used two-handed forms of these weapons, and these are clearly related weapons, and sometimes warhammers on long shafts look exactly like the warhammers on one-handed shafts, and in fact in museums sometimes we can't tell whether it's a one-handed one or a two-handed one because the wooden shafts aren't the original wooden shafts. So sometimes they are identical weapons, sometimes they're short, sometimes they're long. Usually the long ones are used on foot, and pretty much always the short ones are used on horseback, but that doesn't stop someone from using a short one on foot. So what are our sources for how these were used and why these were used? Well, there's a number of sources, but as I mentioned, we don't have a huge number of sources. We've got far more material for swords and indeed poleaxes, the two-handed variety used on foot, than we do for these. But we do have some data for the use of these on foot. One of those is are the treatises of Paulus Hector Meyer, okay, who was a German, very famous in fact, German martial artist, we could loosely call him. He was also a civil servant. He was also ultimately executed for embezzling money from the state to buy old fencing treatises. So he was he was a bit like us. He was fascinated in weapons and martial arts. He saved, actually, a lot of the treatises, like 133, saved a lot of the treatises and then copied elements of them and put them into his own materials. But he was also clearly a very avid martial artist himself. And he made his own books, his own treatises, sometimes incorporating information from older treatises. Now, within those, he does show some techniques which he says can be done with the warhammer or a cudgel, or absolutely with a mace, and they're very, very simple. It's simply, he says, if you've got one of these against someone coming in against you with a lance, then you use the thing to beat the lance aside as you come through and then hit the person back. And he shows a few different ways of doing this. I'm not going to go into depth on that. There isn't a lot of depth actually, but basically to say that it supports and basically gives me the point I made previously about these being used to beat and rebat and then come back with the counter from there. And this is very similar to the techniques which are shown, for example, in Fury with a stick, which are beating things aside, and in the act of raising and beating aside, that chambers you and loads you up to come for the return hit. So it's not a parry riposte sort of situation, it's more of a beat and riposte situation. Now, there's also this fantastic artwork by the famous Italian artist Paolo Uccello in the 1430s, I think it is, which shows a series of scenes. It's a triptych, it's three paintings that are supposed to go together that show the story of the Battle of San Romano, and this is one of the most famous medieval or early Renaissance paintings. And in these paintings, we actually see two warhammers. Okay, maybe we'll study their form and stuff more in future video. But what's interesting is in this most famous scene that I'm showing to you now, we actually see the armoured figure being hit by three different weapons. We see that a lance has come in and probably glanced off his breastplate and gone underneath the reinforce of the pauldron. We see someone couching a sword like a lance. It's a long sword, so I can't quite do it with this, but couching it like a lance, and that has slipped off his left pauldron also. Then we see what was probably a thrust. It could be a strike, but it's probably a thrust coming at his visor, at his eyes. Which, interestingly, so he has a warhammer in his hand, not dissimilar to this, but with a top spike, and he has raised his arm here, and what was the thrust is going off to the side. Now, my interpretation of that, using what we know from Paulus Hector Meyer and Fury and the various, Talhoff and various other treatises, is that's a beat. That's exactly what I've just been describing. So my interpretation of that is he saw that thrust coming at his face, which could have gone through the gap in his visor, and he's gone bang, he's knocked that thrust up off the side, and then he's going to come back down with a strike with the beak. This is called the hammer, this is called the beak of the Warhammer. Now, on that topic, looking through the sources, it is interesting, I think, that when we look at two-handed poleaxes like this, okay, very often we actually see the predominant number of strikes being given with the hammer, and then the beak being used sometimes, but being used for hooking. Okay, what's interesting is if we look at the art for the use of these one-handed Warhammers, we seem to usually predominantly see striking with the beak rather than with the hammer face. Now, what are the different strengths and weaknesses of those two things? Well, I would say overall, hitting them with that face is really functionally very similar to hitting them with a mace. It's going to have an impact, particularly if you aim at their helmet, for example. It'll have a decent amount of impact, but it's less likely to glance off because you've got a larger striking surface. So more of the impact's going to go into the armor or into the head or body, wherever you hit, knee, wherever you hit. More of the energy is likely to go into the target, but you're definitely not going to be penetrating anything or hooking anything. The beak face, however, is very clearly more effective at both hooking things, okay, if you want to get behind someone's helmet and pull them forwards, or back of their knee and pull their leg up. But also, obviously, it's better at penetrating. Now, if you're striking at a mailed gap, like an armpit, or if there's an opening at the side of the neck because of the way that person's bent or whatever, potentially even with thinner plates, even ramming the spike straight through a plate. It's not impossible. We've demonstrated in experiments, and we've archaeologically got examples of square holes through helmets, for example, and other bits of armour. So theoretically, the point could go, it wouldn't usually, but it could potentially go through some bits of armour. So piercing, hooking, stabbing into gaps, that kind of, or kind of hitting into gaps, that kind of stuff. So it could be, and this is only conjectural at this stage, it could be that on horseback they predominantly struck with the point, whereas on foot they predominantly hit with the hammer face. Or it could be against different targets. It could be that against a fully armoured person they prefer to use the point, and against, or rather perhaps in war as well. Obviously in tournaments you're predominantly going to hit with the flat face. But potentially against less armoured people, who knows? Which would you prefer? I mean, I don't know. I mean, the downside with a spike, if you're hitting into someone who's just wearing, let's say, a brigandine or mail, it might go through or into a gap and it might get stuck. The downside of hitting the spike into plate armour, I would say, is it's more likely to glance off, because if that point hits a rounded surface of a pauldron or a breastplate or whatever, it's more likely to twist in the hand and then glance off, whereas if you hit with the flat face, it's more likely to convey more force through the target, maybe. This is all conjectural, and this is something maybe we can experiment with in future videos. So those are some various sources for how these things were used. Defensively, they were for knocking things aside. Offensively, it seems to be that the point, the beak, was predominantly used with the one-handed variety, even if with the two-handed poleaxe variety, it seems like the hammer face was more often used for striking. Now, we've talked about how very few technical sources or treatises actually refer to the Warhammer. I mean, they show it a few times, but they don't really give us very much detail. But there is one source that gives us a little bit more detail, and there's an excellent translation you can get of it. It's by a guy called Pietro Monte, who was a very famous knight tournament fighter of his day, late 1400s, and the treatise that he put together, in fact it was brought out posthumously after he died, called the Collectiana. It's been translated by Geoffrey Forgang, and it's a highly recommended book. It's got loads of interesting stuff of all sorts of topics on there. Maybe we'll do a dedicated video on this at a later point. But he does make some specific comments about the Warhammer. Now, one of the first things he says is blindingly obvious. It says, as soon as you've parried an enemy's blow, you should return a blow with great power. Now, again, this goes back to my earlier point, that instead of a stop and a kind of reload from the stopped position, so parry riposte, instead these should be big motions of beating aside the opponent's incoming attack and then smashing down as hard as you possibly can do. These weapons, especially against armour, will only work with great force applied to them. On that note, he makes the next point, which is really interesting. He says, so assuming you're holding the reins in the left hand, so this is a mounted weapon, this is horseback fighting, he actually says what you can do is you can drape the reins over your arm. It doesn't actually say which arm, but anyway, let's say the reins are out of the hand, and he says another thing you can do is take the hammer in two hands. So even though it's a short hammer, you're relatively close, almost at wrestling distance on your horses next to the opponent. You're in the fight, and you basically take the thing in two hands and use it, even though it's a short weapon, you use it as a two-handed weapon to give blows as powerful as you possibly can do. And he even says, if you target the opponent's weapon in their hand, for example, if they're holding a sword in a gauntlet, then you might be able to smash the weapon out of their hands. Now, there's an interesting parallel here, because in some Islamic sources that talk about the use of the mace, they actually talk about the mace being used to target the opponent's sword, to either knock it out of their hand or even break the sword. So it's actually a very similar technique, aiming at the opponent's weapon with your top-heavy weapon to try and disarm them, essentially. Now, Pietro Monte actually goes into a great amount of detail about the design of the Warhammer, which I'm not going to go into precisely here because it's quite different to this earlier style of Warhammer that I'm showing here. There are various details, just I'll mention a couple of them. He wants it to have a top spike, he wants it to have a cord-wrapped grip, and various other things like this. But anyway, we'll look at that maybe in a future video talking about that specific type of Warhammer, but there is an interesting detail. So this doesn't have it, but many Warhammers have a hook on one side, usually that side, usually that side, okay, such that when you hang it, it would usually, if it was on the right hand side, be with the beak forwards. But this could be hung on a belt, on a sword belt, could be hung on a secondary belt, could be hung on part of the saddle. There's various places you could hang it. And an interesting detail, we always see these as hanging hooks, and it's so that you can hang the Warhammer when you're on your horse, and then you can grab it, pull it off at any time you need. But an interesting detail is that Pietro Monte actually says this hanging hook can be used in combat, and it can be used to snag on an opponent's armor or clothing or equipment. Particularly, he talks about around the head area, and then having hooked it on, you use it like a grappling hook, and then you turn your horse away and ride as hard as you can in the other direction, and you pull them off their horse. So it's a really interesting detail, because if you just look at these examples in museums with the belt hook on the side, you just see it as a belt hook. But it can be used offensively in a technique. In fact, it seems that Pietro Monte rates the Warhammer as a mounted weapon so highly, he even recommends you to have two. And that's, of course, in addition to presumably a lance and a sword. Now, to finish up, we want to consider where the Warhammer came from, because that's actually not a known thing, and I think it's important to state that. But also, why have one at all? I mean, you could also extend this to the mace, but why have one of these instead of just your lance and your sword? So it seems that these fundamentally came into European warfare in the 13th century. We start to see picks being used in manuscripts in scenes of warfare in the 13th century. But there's a very important detail. In the 13th century, we also see an increasing use of spikes on the back of axes. And I think that these two things are connected, because the reason for having a back spike on an axe are clearly a very similar reason to why you might want to have a pick, because fundamentally they are the same weapon. If we ignore the hammer on this and the axe blade on this, these are fundamentally the same weapon. And by the time we get to the 14th century, if we look at something like the Holcomb Bible, we see absolutely loads of axes, and probably most axes used in battle have back spikes. So clearly it's related to the development of armour. In the 13th century, we have got predominantly mail armour, but we're starting to get coater plates. So you've got the full great helm. In the latter part of the 13th century, you've got the beginning of plate defences starting to come in. And in the 14th century, obviously that grows and grows into full plate harness. So I think partially this is a response to that. Now, where did it come from? Well, it could have just been an adaptation of things that already existed, tools. People could have looked at a pick for digging and gone, that might be quite good against armour. Or it's possible it was partly inspired by things in the Middle East. Things had been introduced in the Crusades. It's probably where maces started to get more popular. So obviously maces had been around in Europe since prehistory with stone-headed ones, and we know that maces, for example, are on the Bayeux Tapestry, but we also know that in the Crusades, crusaders took to using maces, and they're sometimes described as Saracen weapons. So it's possible that these were reinvigorated, or kind of people were reminded of the usefulness of these, or yet again it could have just been an internal development because of the increasing use of armour and the levels of armour being worn. So we don't exactly know where this came from. It could have been a combination of all of the things I've mentioned, but what we do know is that the pick and warhammer, horseman's hammer, stayed around until right the way through the 17th century and was still being used, and in some places even in the 18th century, in fact in India still in the 19th century. So a very useful weapon, very important, and hopefully I've given you an idea of how these were used, and that in turn answers the question of why were they used? Fundamentally because they can do things to an armoured opponent, particularly a mounted armoured opponent, that a sword can't do. They can penetrate with more force. They can give more heavy impacts against a head, a helmet for example, more likely to daze and confuse an opponent. But also they can hook in a number of ways. They can either hook with the beak, or they can hook if they've got one of those belt hooks on the side, so they can hook. A sword can't generally hook unless you do it with the pommel end, which is a technique maybe we'll look at in a different video. And so many of the reasons why these were so popular for fighting on foot related to why these, which really are the same weapon just shorter, were so popular for fighting on horseback. Anyway, I hope that gives you a little bit more interest and a little bit more love for the Warhammer. It was, you could say it was a more important weapon on foot in the form of the poleaxe, but certainly lots of the top level horsemen of the day, including Pietro Monte and 17th century cuirassiers, thought that the horseman's pick, or the short poleaxe or short warhammer, was an incredibly useful weapon, and so forth. Therefore they carried them a lot, and there's a fair number around in museums around the world, so they are fantastic things. Hopefully that gives you a little bit more insight into how they were used. I have been Matt Easton, I will continue to be, and hopefully you're subscribed. Please check and click that button if you're not, and hopefully I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.